Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Jeffrey Lees, Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior in the Faculty of Economics and Business at the University of Groningen. His research utilizes experimental methods to study belief traps show inaccurate beliefs drive negative outcomes for organizations, the environment, and politics. Professor Jeffrey examines the psychological and social roots of belief traps, their role in organizational inaction and political conflict, and strategies to counter them through targeted interventions. Professor Jeffrey Lees earned his PhD in organizational behavior and psychology from Harvard Business School. He later served as a visiting professor at Clemson University and as an associate research scholar at Princeton University. In this episode, Professor Jeffrey Lee shares key insights from his research, breaking free from belief traps, how misconceptions shape organizational and environmental outcomes. So, without further delay, let's welcome Professor Jeffrey Lee to the podcast. Professor Jeffrey, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you. I am very much looking forward.
Professor, what exactly are belief traps and how do they emerge in organizational and environmental context?
So, a belief trap is ultimately it's about misconceptions, but it's a specific way of understanding misperceptions. Belief traps are systematic, collective misperceptions about what each other believe. So a sort of classic example that I think a lot of people have probably experienced, like a team context, is imagine you're in a presentation and you think the presentation is pretty bad, but you think you're looking at everyone else in the room and you think everybody else likes it, so you don't express your disapproval or your criticism. But in reality, everyone else in the room is doing the same thing. So, in truth, the true preferences is that everyone in the room doesn't like what's being presented. But because they all hold this collective misperception about what other people believe, no one says anything. Um, and unless that misperception is broken later, where people talk to each other, everybody walks out with a private belief that is not expressed and a misperception of what the collective group of other people believe. Um, and that is a microcosm of what we consider a belief trap. And you can think about that playing at a broader level, right? So it's not just the people in the room, but it's a relevant set of stakeholders. So if you're a politician, it's your constituents. If you're a CEO, it's, external stakeholders, other organizations. If you're in an organization, it could be other departments. Um, we're always trying to imagine what relevant stakeholders and reference groups think, particularly in sort of normative domains of what we should be doing, in addition to what do people do, right? So there's like the descriptive domain, what do people do? But this is the normative domain. What do I think people ought to do? And what do I think other people think they ought to do? All right. And if we get those if we're systematically wrong in those judgments, right? Not just wrong in general, like people can be wrong, but if that wrongness is randomly distributed, right? If it's just from a lack of information, just because you haven't spoken to the relevant stakeholder, you don't know. But there are ways in which those misperceptions can be systematically biased in a given direction, and if that bias is represented among everybody trying to make those judgments, then you get that situation I described, which is like the private belief is among everybody is in one direction, but their perceptions of others' beliefs is in another direction. And then that drives a particular behavior. In that case of that like team situation, that presentation, it drives silence, it drives inaction, and it might drive right people to agree to a decision. So let's say the presentation is about the adoption of some new policy or whatnot, new product, doesn't really matter. If everybody is sitting there nodding their head because they're trying to conform to what they think other people believe, a decision might be made that's actually not aligned at all with people's preferences. But because people are so attuned to what they think is social norms, they remain silent. And so that specific instance we call a spiral of silence. But more broadly, you can think about that as just like the ways in which these misperceptions drive inaction. And so that's the belief trap, the ways in which we have systematic misperceptions about what other people believed that are systematically biased. And then that ultimately leads to decision making that's not aligned with either your own preferences or the preferences of the people that you're imagining.
Professor, how do psychological and social factors contribute to the persistence of belief traps, even when evidence contradicts them?
Also, a great question. Because this is a truly social phenomenon, both of those things interact, right? So you can, as a scientist, I think about all those different factors. So there are the purely psychological factors. So like, what information do you have? How are you? What are you perceiving in the room? In the context of thinking about, relevant stakeholders, like what stereotypes do you hold of those stakeholders? And I don't mean that I mean that in the broadest sense, like not just like the narrow, you have negative stereotypes, but like, if you're a firm in one industry and you have to work with stakeholders in another industry, like you probably just have like a guess of the ways in which they're different and similar to you, and you're basing a lot of your judgments on how they're going to react or what they think or what they feel based on those sort of broad stereotypes. So, you can have an understanding of that sort of stereotypic thinking, the ways that we make assumptions about other people based on limited information. Those are psychological processes. But then there's the more socially bounded processes. Like I said, you're in a room, you're observing other people because this is both a collective phenomena. And when I say collective, I mean that in two senses, right? It is about your perception of the collective, and it is a misperception that is held at the collective level. So there have to be, right, this is not simply something determined purely by what's in your head. It's determined about the interaction between you and your perception of the collective, right? So what are you seeing other people doing? What's the information that you're getting about other people that's leading you to have these systematic misperceptions? Um, and again, like the interaction is important. Like stereotypes don't come out of nowhere, right? You get those stereotypes from the world, like from the news, from rumors, from the few pieces of information that you have, right? And those are socially determined. So there are a lot of ways in which social and structural factors can systematically drive these misperceptions. Because again, what's important here is not just this misperception, not just that there's like random error, it's that there's systematic error. And in order for there to be systematic error, there has to either be a systematic psychological mechanism pushing the error in one direction, or there has to be some structural factor pulling that error in one direction. And so understanding what those are is really a big part of the scientific endeavor of understanding belief traps.
Very insightful. Professor, can you share real-world examples of how belief traps have led to poor decision-making in organizations or environmental policies?
One of the things that is so difficult about studying belief traps is, I think, the by far the most common like real world example, the real world behaviors that it leads to is inaction, right? And it's so hard to, right? Inaction is a black box, right? Why didn't the organization do this, right? There's a million things that could go into that equation. All right. It's so much easier, right? Usually when you make an affirmative decision, it's usually pretty easy to locate like why this decision was made. But when a decision is not made, it's much more of a black box, right? And that is where us as scholars are really interested in, right? Why don't organizations adopt more sustainability policies? Why don't they take a stand? Why don't they, right? Even in non-normative domains, why don't they adopt a product? Why don't they pivot, right? And it's so hard to study that, right? Because like if you take like a data mindset, like studying zeros is hard, right? If your data set is all zeros, it's like, okay, what's going on? And I think that's by far the biggest tragedy of the belief traps is that they just lead to inaction and pessimism, depending on the domain. Climate is a clear example. There's a mountain of data to show the following, and I think it's best summarized that way, which is that like a super majority of voters support aggressive climate change policy, and that super majority thinks they are the minority, right? So you have overwhelming public support for the type of policies needed to attenuate the climate change and the damage that it causes, but people don't realize that. And not only do voters not realize that, the people they elect don't realize that. So there's also evidence that politicians also hold these belief traps. And so you just get inaction on climate change when in fact there is massive public support for action. but no one sees that public support. And that's a good example because you can think about, right, it's not just about mind reading, it's about the mechanisms, right? It's not just like you can't just show a politician a poll and like this gets to your question of like even in contexts where there's contradictory evidence, which is part of your previous question, right? You can't just show a politician a poll and they're going to change their mind completely. Like they're getting information from other ways, right? So it's like maybe there's not a lot of people at the climate protest, and that's not because and people didn't show up not because they don't care, but because they don't think other people will care. So everyone, so just like in that boardroom where it's like no one speaks up, right? It's like no one goes to the protests when they would all actually want to go, and so there's all these ways in which the belief traps manifest in behavior or a lack of behavior, and then they self-reinforce, right? So you show the politician the poll that, hey, 75% of your constituents support this policy, but then the politician's like, but I went to the protest and it was small. And so then they like that belief trap reinforces itself in the social environment. And that's just one example in politics, but you can imagine that happening in organizational context as well. Right? Even when there's one data point to suggest that the belief trap is wrong, to maybe punctuate that belief, there's always these social forces reinforcing the underlying misperception that are so hard to overcome. And then ultimately, like I said, from a scientific point of view, when you're trying to study inaction, like you're studying a data set of zeros, and it just makes it really hard to disentangle that. But that ultimately what I think is what makes it worthwhile um, to
Yeah.
study.
Professor, what role does groupthink play in reinforcing belief traps within corporate or political decision-making structures?
It's a good question. It really depends on how you define groupthink. So, like the traditional definition of groupthink is people is sort of like the traditional definition is like if your traditional definition is like the sort of group polarization definition, where people's attitudes become more extreme as they interact with like-minded others, then that's tangentially related because then a big part of belief traps is often projection, right? So if you hold an attitude that's not aligned with the majority members, you might assume other people agree with you, and that's a very general tendency. People assume other people agree with them. People assume on average that other people are more like them than they actually are and their preferences and personality and things like that. And so if your own preferences have been affected by groupthink, then that can be a mechanism of the misperception. But uh, groupthink is a very broad term, and so it's often used to sort of describe um, the sort of active version of the example I laid out in the beginning, which is like a group is doing something and they're active and they're moving forward and they're making more and more extreme decisions, and the majority of the group members don't support that, but they think they're in the minority and they don't speak up. And so then the group then barrels towards a decision that becomes more and more extreme and more divorced from the goals or from reality or from the data. And it could have been stopped if people realized that the force, like probably a minority within the group, are pushing for this more extreme option. But because no one really spoke up, no one sort of popped that groupthink bubble, then you end up getting to an extreme decision. And that's a much more classic example of a belief trap, where it's like the decisions being made by people in the moment to not speak up, to not stop, is that belief trap, right? They misperceive the norm in the room and they make decisions about what they do or do not say based on that misperception of the norm. And so if that's like a good, if you think groupthink is part of that process, then belief traps are a core mechanism of it.
What are some effective strategies leaders can use to identify and challenge belief traps in their organizations?
So belief traps are really about, you know, like I said, they're collective in two sense. They are collective in the sense that they are about misperceptions of the collective and they are misperceptions held by the collective. So it's not just usually you, right? It only happens if the majority of the group is holding these belief traps. And so right, belief traps are really about testing your assumptions. And I said in the beginning, like one mechanism of belief traps is like stereotypes. So that's a really good example of just like you're making an assumption about what other people believe. And usually there's data on that. Like that, it can be hard data, like it can be survey data, right? Or but it can also just be experiential data. So like for an organizational context, right? um, Belief traps about what external stakeholders want is a classic example where like you can go down a huge line of decision making and not realize that it's all contingent on an assumption about what a relevant stakeholder wants. Where like maybe if you paused and say like let's get someone on the phone or let's get someone with the relevant expertise in that domain to really make sure that this assumption is solid is important. And that's so hard because the nature of the belief trap is a shared assumption. And so being able to recognize when you're making assumption about other people's preferences um, and having ways of like testing those assumptions, that's really important. And it can be very, again, it can be very data driven in the broad sense of the term, right? Just often it's just asking but in certain cases like sometimes if you're talking if like the stakeholders are consumers, right, you have a marketing department whose job it is to assess consumer preferences, like don't make assumptions, collect the data. um but in like a C-suite decision making context, like pick up the phone and call the relevant stakeholder and have a conversation with them, um and then just voice those preferences, like giving people. And there's it's really hard to you often hear this advice of like try to have a devil's advocate in the room, try to have someone who's always there giving a counter perspective, and that's really important. But what we know from groups research is that the pressure, the perceived social pressure to conform to the perceived norm is extremely strong. And so it's really important that the people tr doing that, the people either being the devil's advocate or the people slowing down and challenging assumptions, it's really important that those people are leaders, that those are people who are empowered to do that, who are and who for whom like their authority will sort of help pop the bubble, right? Because you can have an instance where someone does question the assumption, but if that person is like the lowest person on the totem pole or is not someone who has a lot of legitimacy or respect, it's not going to have any effect. It has to really come from a leader. And so thinking about that and recognizing that process, like recognizing that you are making assumptions about the collective preferences of others and you're basing a bunch of decisions on those assumptions, recognizing that like it's in a very automatic process, right? Like so again, like we know like stereotypes are often implicit, right? They're often just a quick assumption based on someone's group identity, right? And that applies to, right? And again, we think about stereotypes as in the narrow context, like members of racial groups, but like it happens with like people in an industry, right? Like you have stereotypes of people in a given industry or organizations in a given industry or the reputation of a given stakeholder, whether they're a regulator or another firm, or another department in your organization, right? And we make these very casual assumptions very quickly that are often unfounded, and then lead to a string of bad decision making.
Professor, how can behavioral interventions or nudges help correct misconceptions and drive better decision making?
Um, so I think that you can think a little you can think specifically about sort of what I laid out very broadly before, which is that there's one form of misperception correction where it's like people believe something that's false and the truth is out there, so you can fact check, right? You can get the truth and present it the truth. But here, like because it's such a group-based phenomena, you have to think beyond just like the fact check, right? You have to shatter the spiral of silence where people don't express their own preferences. So like a good tool is like a again use like a political metaphor, private ballot, right? Like give people the opportunity to express their preferences privately and anonymously. That's like if you're in a context where you can do that, nothing that will shatter the belief trap very quickly because you will immediately see that people are expressing their true preferences and you'll be like, oh, holy crud. We were totally wrong. Like we've all been misperceiving each other's preferences. And usually it's very illuminating because usually it's like, oh wow, we actually all agree in a way that we didn't appreciate. Um, or there's massive disagreement, and then it's like, okay, let's stop and address it. So like you have to be considerate to the social factors, like just sort of mechanical fact checking often doesn't work because it often doesn't tackle the social silencing aspect. So giving people ways to express their preferences anonymously slash privately is a big one. Um, and then again, just having some way of making sure that you're not making these assumptions about relevant stakeholders in a decision making context is really important too. Mm.
Professor, how do emerging technologies such as AI and big data influence belief traps? Do they help debunk them or reinforce them?
I love this question, and like I don't have a good answer, right? And AI is such a fast evolving field. I think one of the good ways to understand AI, both from its benefits and its downfalls, is to understand that AI is very quotidian, right? It is very good at reproducing something that's very typical and very average and very narrow in its variance. And that can be great when you want to write something really clear, but that my concern is that that also has the potential, right, precisely because of this definition of belief traps, right? It's right, this is not you think vaccines cause a disease and they don't, and like if you fact check that, like any fact checking website will debunk that. Like this is by definition a collective misperception that's socially determined. And insofar as I can imagine a context where AI is confronted with a belief trap, because its sort of modal way of processing information is to make it as quotidian as possible, I would imagine that AI is going to be more likely to reproduce and reinforce rather than debunk a given belief trap. But it's really context dependent, right? And it's really socially dependent too. Again, it's really about and that's one of the things that makes it so it's not difficult to study, but it's just the nature of studying it is it's so context dependent. It's like who are you thinking about? Right. So I study belief traps really in two contexts, business and politics. And like they could not be more different contexts. And it's really hard to generalize across them because right, Democrats imagining what Republicans think is very different than, people in industry A imagining what stakeholders in industry B think, right? So much so that it's really hard to generalize across them, and so it really does depend. And like I can be optimistic and think about like there are contexts where AI would actually be better, and especially if AI, um, yeah, insofar as like the belief trap bubble can be popped through existing data, through survey data, like if there's public opinion data, or historical data, right? If AI can capture that and present that accurately, then it does have the potential. But the when I think of AI, I think of it in a sort of an atomized sense, like a person sitting at the computer. So you start into that problem even if my beliefs are updated, I still have to overcome those social forces. Um, so, but yeah, it's really hard. It's hard to say, and I don't know. I would be really curious to it like, do people go to ChatGPT to ask these sorts of social questions, right? Like, is there anyone going into ChatGPT asking like, hey, what's it like working at this organization, or like, um, I don't know. Like that's a really interesting question. The extent to which people use ChatGPT to assess these like these social evaluations that we in social science usually think of as sort of amorphous and like very much based on vibes, not on hard data. So I would be really curious actually how to see evidence as to the extent to which people use AI to try to access that information. Like we know people use AI to try to access like factual information, like look up recipes or look up like how to fix something. But do they use AI to try to assess social information? I don't know. And I don't. I think obviously I think this is a fruitful avenue for future research. But if I had to bet, on average, AI would worsen, not better, belief traps, but it's extremely domain dependent.
Professor, my last question. What advice would you give to business leaders, policymakers, and individuals looking to cultivate a mindset that resists belief traps?
My big advice would be, you know, as I sort of laid out before, it's very social. And I think in my experience working with business leaders and consulting and being in the classroom, I think people have sort of what I call a naive rationalism, which is they see themselves and they see others being driven by mostly rational processes. And we know from research that people both underestimate the extent to which they themselves and other people are affected by social processes. And so like you're going to fall for belief traps if you see yourself as super rational and you tell yourself almost certainly incorrectly that no, I'm not the type of person who is affected by others, right? And like that's just there might be those people there, but that's not true. Like we know that social influence is incredibly strong, and it's really hard to see the ways in which you yourself are affected by it. And so like being, rather than being mindful of this question of data and fact checking, like that's important, but that really comes from this like rationalist belief that like my decision making is driven simply by the access to information that I have. Being aware and open to the reality that you're likely being influenced by the people around you really opens up a whole domain of mindfulness that really then helps you see, oh, wait a minute, like I didn't speak up in that room, and like maybe I should have, right? It helps you catch yourself engaging in that motivated reasoning, rationalizing your behavior, and sort of post hoc interpreting it as a rationalist decision rather than something driven by social forces. And being open to that possibility, being humbled in that way, um, really allows you to begin to see how those processes are affecting you and therefore ways in which you can overcome them.
Professor Jeffrey Lees, thank you for an enlightening conversation on the power of belief traps and their impact on organizational and environmental decision making. Your insights into the psychological and social roots of these misconceptions and how they can be countered through targeted interventions offer valuable takeaways for leaders, policymakers, and anyone looking to drive meaningful change. To our listeners, thank you for joining us in this thought-provoking discussion. If you would like to explore more of Professor Lee's work, be sure to check out his research and follow his latest insights. Until next time, stay curious and challenge the beliefs that shape your world. Thank you once again, Professor Jeffrey Lees, for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.